Hi, my name's Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of our co-sponsor tonight, the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, I want to welcome you out to our event. I want to thank both the School of PPPA and my collaborator in these events, Bill Kabasenche, for helping us organize this and for hosting it. This is, I think, about our sixth Science, Ethics, and Public Policy Forum, and I think we have a really good one for you this evening. Our topic tonight is looking at the ethics of the use of fetal tissue in scientific research. We have a distinguished panel, and let me introduce them, and then I'll turn the time over to our moderator. On our panel tonight, we have Christopher Tollefsen, who is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. Our second panelist tonight is Terry Hassold, who is a professor in the School of Molecular Biosciences in the School of Veterinary Medicine here at WSU. Our third panelist tonight is an old friend of mine, and I think we can accurately describe her as a rate buster in the academy, Leslie Francis. Leslie holds joint appointments as Alfred E. Emery Professor of Law and is the Professor of Philosophy at the University of Utah. Our moderator for tonight is my colleague in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. He's a clinical associate professor. His name is Bill Kabasenche. He's on the end down here. I'm going to give him the microphone here in just a minute. He teaches and does research in the area of bioethics. So join me now in welcoming our guests.
Thank you for that. So, if you've been paying attention to the news at all, you might have guessed how we chose the topic we've got for today with the Planned Parenthood videos that have been in the news for a little while now. And in fact, that's kind of how we pick our topics. We just look at the news and try to find something at the intersection of science, ethics, and public policy. And so I think we've got a good topic in that respect tonight. And the speakers are going to go in that order. We're going to start with science, and then we're going to go to ethics, and then we're going to go to actually a little more ethics, but also some public policy and law with respect to these issues.
As Bill alluded, I am the science nerd portion of the program. I'm really delighted to be here as a spokesman for researchers who use fetal tissue, and this is really appropriate for me because my entire scientific career has been based on examination of human pregnancies and really asking more than anything else what goes wrong or what can go wrong with human pregnancies. Okay, so let's get going. When we think of human fetal tissue research, I think it's hard right now not to think of the Planned Parenthood videos and the controversy surrounding the procurement of human fetuses, of first or second trimester human fetuses for biomedical research. However, at the outset, I want to make two comments. First of all, regardless of what you think about the ethics of this kind of research, I think is inescapable, and it's important to recognize that this research has resulted in a number of really important medical advances. And secondly, I think it's really important to recognize that this kind of research really reflects only one type of human fetal tissue science. And what I mean by that is that over the years, scientists have studied tissues from ongoing pregnancies, and this is where we have obtained tissue, for example, from placental material, small sections of placental material, from the fluid that surrounds the fetus, from fetal cells, or recently, even from free fetal DNA that resides in maternal blood, all in an attempt to make prenatal diagnoses of fetal anomalies. In addition, we've done exhaustive studies of human miscarriages, trying to understand the reason why pregnancies are lost before birth. And more recently, we've studied early embryos from in vitro fertilization procedures to try to improve the likelihood of success in this setting, in the assisted reproduction technology or the ART world. So it's important to know that there's not just one type of human fetal tissue research, but there are many. And so what I want to try to do now, and for my time, is tell you about my own group's activities in this arena, which until very recently focused primarily on human miscarriages. I think most of us probably assume that miscarriages are extremely uncommon events. And I have to tell you that there are a few scientific facts that I want you to walk away from this talk with, and this is one of them. Miscarriages are an extraordinary common complication of human pregnancy. So if we look at conceptions that survive until the time of clinical recognition of the pregnancy, that's about 6 to 8 weeks pregnancy. No fewer than 15 to 20% of all of those pregnancies miscarry by about 20 weeks of pregnancy. And we know that this is a gross underestimate of the real frequency of miscarriage in our species, because we know that many conceptions actually perish in utero before the time that they're clinically recognized. So miscarriage is a very common event in human pregnancies, but the underlying reasons for this were not clear for many years. And in fact, this is what I and a lot of researchers spent much time working on. And so this slide shows a paper of ours from what I think of as probably scientific antiquity. This is actually from 1980, and it was a study on the causes of miscarriages, in which we use a very simple first-generation genomic approach, chromosome analysis, to investigate the cause of miscarriage. The approach is really straightforward. All that you do is you make a chromosome preparation from cultured cells from miscarried fetuses, and you count the number of chromosomes. And if you get to 46, almost certainly you have a genetically normal fetus. But if you get another number, for example, in this instance, an extra chromosome 16 or trisomy 16, you found the reason for the miscarriage. Because abnormalities like this, in which you have extra or missing whole chromosomes, are incompatible with life. So many laboratories conducted these kinds of studies. This slide shows our laboratory's results on over 5,000 miscarriages collected over about 2 decades. And what they showed us was really quite surprising at the time, because as you can see here, the majority of miscarriages actually had a chromosome abnormality. That was the reason for the miscarriage. And so what this tells us is that over 1/2 of all miscarriages, and by extrapolation, over 10% of all human pregnancies involve fetuses that don't have the right number of chromosomes. So this indicates that, surprisingly, at least to us initially, human reproduction is an extraordinary error-prone process. And in addition, these kinds of studies told us quite a bit about the nature of these errors. For example, we found out that most of the errors, the vast majority of these kinds of chromosome errors, are maternal in origin. They occur because of problems in the development of the oocyte. And additionally, and as I'm sure many of you already are aware of, and this is the second of those scientific facts that I want you to take out of this talk, is that there is an extraordinary increase in the incidence of miscarriages and specific categories of chromosome errors with increasing age of the woman. This is arguably the most important etiological risk factor in association with any human genetic disorder. Okay, we generated a lot of data in these studies, but is any of this useful? Has society benefited in any way from these kinds of studies? Well, I'm obviously biased, but obviously I think the answer is yes. We've got a better understanding of human reproduction and of things that can go wrong in human reproduction. But additionally, the work from these miscarriages, number one, fundamentally changed medical genetic practices and genetic counseling practices, and it really prompted us to focus on the realities of pregnancies involving women at the extremes of reproductive age, or even women that are not nearing reproductive senescence, but maybe in their 30s. Number two, it informed the newly emerging assisted reproductive technology community, and it's resulted in a real extraordinary emphasis being placed on genetic screening and genetic testing of embryos that are derived from assisted reproduction. But I think most importantly, these studies of miscarriages provided us the reason for over 1/2 of these cases and indicated that simple genetic testing could provide the reason for what can be a tragic loss of a pregnancy. And in fact, for me, unquestionably the most satisfying aspect of my career has been being able to counsel couples who have had this traumatic experience and to be able to provide them first with the reason for the miscarriage, and secondly, to be able to tell them that there was nothing they could do or nothing that they didn't do that affected the pregnancy, to let them know that these events are remarkably common in humans, and then finally to let them know that their risks in future pregnancies are not elevated, at least by comparison with other couples of similar age. And I can assure you that these conversations continue, and they continue to provide a great deal of comfort for couples that are going through these extremely difficult experiences. Okay, so where do we go from here? Is there something else? Is there some information or something we can do that might improve the chances of successful pregnancies for couples? And I don't know the answer to that, but one obvious place to look is obviously the human egg because of the high rate of chromosome error. This is unfortunately easier said than done because of the complicated and very long life cycle of the human egg. The human egg begins development before birth in the fetal ovary, but it may not complete its development until the time doesn't complete its development until the time of fertilization, which may be up to 45 to 50 years later. So this complication has led many researchers to turn to model organisms to study, mice, rats, or yeast. And in fact, WSU has a number of world-class reproductive biologists that study eggs or study sperm and address crucial questions such as whether exposures to a variety of environmental risk factors, BPA in plastic bottles, pesticides, other kinds of pollutants, whether those things might affect the development of eggs or sperm. Unfortunately, there's an extremely important drawback to all of these kinds of studies of model organisms, and that's simply the fact that the human species is the only species known to have the rate of chromosome error that we have. And in fact, other species that have been studied have a rate of error that's an order of magnitude lower than us. So the problem with studying mice and rats with respect to chromosome errors is that those observations, unfortunately, may not be relevant to us. And accordingly then, a number of groups, both here and abroad, including our group, have begun studies of human eggs at different stages of their development, asking when and how errors might arise that will give these chromosomally abnormal embryos. One kind of study involves fetal ovaries obtained either from elective or from therapeutic abortions, because this is the time when chromosomes are programmed to move around the cell, the egg nucleus, to find their partner chromosomes, to become closely aligned with them and to exchange genetic material. And that's what you're seeing here. We see in red chromosome-associated proteins that are beginning to form, bringing partner chromosomes together, and then finally forming long, completely formed linear structures to hold the chromosomes in tight register with one another. And this happens except when an abnormality occurs, such as we might be able to see here, where some of these structures aren't completely linear. There's one here that looks as if it's got little antennae at the end. And unfortunately, this kind of situation we know eventually leads to chromosome errors. Surprisingly, when we have studied human eggs and we've studied human sperm, we see that in sperm, these kinds of errors are extraordinarily rare. And when we study human eggs, these kinds of errors are extraordinarily common. So what this means is that a proportion of human eggs are predisposed to errors right from the get-go. These studies are still in their infancy, but what they have told us is that we have a very long way to go in our understanding of how, when, and why human eggs are so vulnerable to these kinds of errors. I want to finish my presentation by talking about one other type of human fetal tissue research area that really is on the rise now, and that's research associated with assisted reproduction. I think it's important to remember that something on the order of about 10% of all couples in developed countries, including the US, are either infertile or subfertile, and until the advent of assisted reproductive technologies, they had little, if any, hope of having children of their own. Art has changed all of this, and in fact, well over 1% of all pregnancies in the US now involve some aspect of assisted reproduction. There are complications to assisted reproduction, though, and of in particular importance. Women seeking art are typically older, and in fact, if you talk to assisted reproductive docs, they'll tell you that the major impediment they face is the fact that they deal with older women, and there's a high frequency of chromosome abnormalities. In fact, in many assisted reproductive clinics, it's now standard practice to genetically test one or a small number of eggs from embryos, and then select those that are normal to implant to initiate a pregnancy. This, in fact, has now become a critical aspect of assisted reproduction, and it is interesting in this regard that one of the leaders in the field, Nathan Treff, actually trained here at WSU. Okay, so what I've tried to highlight in my brief presentation are a few areas in which human fetal research is contributing to medical practice. It's, I think, important to note a couple things. First of all, that this research is closely monitored, in our instance by our funding agency, the National Institutes of Health, as well as by university and hospital review panels that oversee human subjects research. It's also, I think, important to note that this research, even that associated with intentional terminations of pregnancy, is legal, as are the abortions themselves, and that this kind of work is sanctioned by both state and federal authorities. And as long as that remains the case, this type of research has, is, and hopefully will continue to make important contributions to our understanding of human fetal development and human health in general. I think given the many important health issues that face us as a society, the Zika virus, quality of our water, the potential health effects of environmental contaminants, the importance of studying ourselves really can't be overstated. And thus, respectfully, I urge you to question why so many are demonizing biomedical researchers and those people who facilitate biomedical research. We're not ghouls, we're not fiends, we're unlikely to appear on the next episode of The Walking Dead. We're scientists, your tax dollars pay us to ask important questions, and we're trying to find the best ways to do just that. Thank you.
I'm going to ask 3 questions, and I'm going to give answers that I think will probably put me in the minority on the panel that I'm on, and probably in a minority here. I'm certainly in a minority at my own university. I think it's fair to say that at my own university, if people at my university wanted to annoy visitors, they would lock them in a room with me and ask me to talk about embryos with them. So don't be annoyed. I am going to outline a view that probably most of you disagree with, but at least I want to suggest that it has some plausibility, and that plausibility is important to take into account in thinking about some of the considerations that people raise about this sort of research. So the 3 questions that I'm going to ask: first, what is the moral issue at stake in fetal tissue research, and why do some people object to it? Second, what issues of complicity arise for researchers and eventual beneficiaries of fetal tissue research? And third, what steps can be taken to eliminate or minimize those difficulties? So the first question on the moral issues, I think there's nothing intrinsically wrong or immoral about research on deceased human fetuses, any more than there is about research on other deceased human beings. It's of course impossible to get the consent of the fetus, but in most cases, or in some cases, that consent could be provided by one or both parents after a spontaneous miscarriage. So if there's moral controversy, it's not simply that that there's research involving dead human fetuses. The moral controversy here is entirely related to the manner of the fetus's death. If that death occurs by induced abortion, then it creates grave difficulties for those who believe that abortion is a wrongful taking of a human being's life. And that claim is often denied. One example, familiar to you if you watched the world's most boring Super Bowl recently. During the Super Bowl, NARAL tweeted in regard to the now infamous Doritos commercial, if everybody has seen the Doritos commercial that I'm talking about, that it used, quote, the anti-choice tactic of humanizing fetuses. Now, of course, if humanizing fetuses is merely a tactic, that is, if fetuses are not really human beings, then there's really very little ground for objecting to the practice of abortion. But I think that a look at every textbook of developmental biology published over the last 30 years reveals something else. Here's a representative case. This is Keith Moore's The Developing Human, Clinically Oriented Embryology. Quote, human life begins at fertilization, the process during which a male gamete or sperm unites with the female gamete or oocyte to form a single cell called a zygote. This highly specialized totipotent cell marked the beginning of each of us as a unique individual, end quote. And another quote from the same book, a zygote is the beginning of a new human being, that is, an embryo, end quote. Now there are some philosophical objections to this claim where very early embryos are concerned, specifically embryos that are still capable of dividing into monozygotic twins, so maybe up to about the 14-day mark. And that has some bearing about how we might think about the closely related but not identical issue of embryonic stem cell research. But there's really no plausible philosophical or biological reason for thinking that a 6 to 8 week fetus, for instance, is anything other than a human being. So the fetuses whose post-abortion remains are used in scientific research are indeed human beings. And if one additionally thinks that human rights and human equality are predicated on the equal humanity of the holders of those rights and the possessors of that equality, then one will think that human embryos and fetuses should be the holders of human rights, such as the right not to be intentionally killed, and possessors of equality with all other members of the species Homo sapiens. Of course, there are plenty of other philosophical and moral views in the domain, in the region here, right? But this is one that has some plausibility. When Bill teaches or uses the book of mine, Embryo, Defense of Human Life, he refers to this as the equality view. Every human being is equal to one another. If you accept that set of claims, then not only the practice of abortion, but also the use of fetal remains from abortions will look different. And this brings us to the second question, the question of complicity. If you accept those premises, then you should worry about complicity. And we worry about that in other domains as well. Are our clothes made by barely paid workers in sweatshops? Are our strawberries picked by exploited migrant workers? Right? We worry about our own complicity in these cases. But our worries would be considerably increased if the abused or exploited producers of our food or clothing were actually being killed, deliberately or wrongly in the process. And our concerns would be even more intensified if we were not just the recipients of those benefits far downstream, but were owners of a business partnering with the sweatshop or hiring the overseer of immigrant workers. Complicity typically increases as we approach closer proximity to the wrongdoing from which we might benefit, and for several reasons. One of those reasons is a worry about cooperation. Am I facilitating the immoral work that is being done by others? This probably is the case when a Western company partners with an overseas production company that it knows exploits its workers. For the sake of an inexpensive product, the Western company cooperates with those exploitative processes. Sometimes this seems to be the case in fetal tissue research. The Center for Medical Progress Undercover videos suggest the possibility of a close and cooperative relationship between some tissue providers and some tissue researchers. But there are other concerns even when cooperation is not on the table, such as concerns for witness and scandal. Am I standing up for what I think is right and renouncing what I think is wrong? Will others be led to infer my support for these practices based on what they see me doing? Will bringing good out of a process that I think is immoral lead other people to think that it's not, after all, morally problematic? Will it lead me to think that? In the case of researchers who believe that the practice of abortion involves unjust killing of innocent human beings, these considerations seem sufficient to warrant a judgment that they shouldn't engage in research on tissue from aborted fetuses. What about the case of those further downstream from the research who will one day be offered benefits procured through that research, some of which Terry has just been discussing, very important benefits? Katha Pollitt, writing in The Nation, thinks that answering the question reveals the hypocrisy of those who have moral objections to the use of fetal tissue. She writes, quote, "If you think fetal tissue is wrong and should be banned, would you refuse to use any therapies that may come out of it? I thought not. I've posed this question to abortion opponents before, but so far no one has said, yes, Katha, I would rather let Alzheimer's turn my brain into cottage cheese and ketchup than benefit from this diabolical practice. If I get Parkinson's, HIV, breast cancer, diabetes, or the flu, if I go blind from macular degeneration, if I have a miscarriage, so be it. Treatments for those conditions are still being developed, but surprise, if you have been vaccinated for polio, mumps, measles, chickenpox, hepatitis, or rabies, it might be too late for you to stand your ethical ground. You've already benefited from fetal tissue research," end quote. So that's all Katha Pollitt. I think her argument here is a bit too quick. Our entire world, unfortunately, is built on benefits that have emerged from historically unjust and sometimes barbaric practices, such as slavery. It's neither obligatory nor possible to say no to all of them. One's obligation is primarily in going forward. What practices should we reform now? What activities should we refuse to participate in henceforth? What role do my actions play in perpetuating an ongoing injustice? And for the most part, I think these are more pressing questions for researchers than for future beneficiaries. Nevertheless, even those might, for the sake of witness, for instance, make a stand where some of those benefits are concerned, especially where the wrong is recent or ongoing. The situation of beneficiaries seems potentially different when we're talking about vaccinations created in the 1960s or when we're considering imminent benefits from continuing fetal tissue research programs. But again, the lines of connection can become very attenuated. And even, Terry, when you were talking about the research that you're doing on fetal ovaries, right, the payoff for that is going to be well down the road and many steps removed from the original abortions that gave us the fetal tissue. So then, what should we do to minimize or eliminate, if possible, these problems? Well, if abortion were not permitted by law, the question would answer itself. Just as no one needs to worry about complicity with chattel slavery in the US, no one would need to worry about complicity in abortion. Although, of course, there are arguably other forms of slavery that do right now raise important questions of complicity for us. But this isn't our situation. Nor at the moment is the next most important step, defunding research on aborted human beings. There's a great deal to be said for this, I think. Abortion is thought to be justified in part on grounds of privacy. It's a woman's private, personal decision. But fetal tissue research, as I've argued, or rather fetal tissue research as a part of the world of contemporary science is anything but private. As I've argued in conjunction with the related questions about embryonic stem cell research elsewhere, the practice of science is public in its subject matter, the natural world that's shared and experienced by us all, and its methodology, with its emphasis on publicly testable hypothesis, publication of result, and public discussion and criticism, and results, such as the various vaccines cited by Pollitt. When we add to that the fact that public science is in great measure publicly funded, then we see, I think, that all citizens, including those morally opposed to abortion, have a real stake in ensuring that public science not only benefits the general public, and I don't think that we can question that it does, but does so in accordance with norms that can be accepted by as many citizens as possible. And that suggests that public money should be used, again, to the extent possible, on research projects that do not traverse important and widely held moral norms and convictions, even if those norms are the subject of dispute and controversy. Finally, what about the circumstances in which none of these steps has been taken, and in which abortion is permitted and there's federal funding for fetal tissue research? This is the situation that we're in today. I think in that case, we still want to create as high a wall as possible between the abortion and the science. There are currently federal restrictions on researchers paying for fetal tissue, though procurement costs may be compensated, on changing the method or timing of abortion for the sake of providing tissue, and on providing tissue without appropriate parental consent. These are important as far as they go, and I think there's maybe some reasons for skepticism that they're uniformly followed, upheld, and enforced across the board. And I don't think that the presence of these norms suffices to make it possible for pro-life researchers to participate in fetal tissue research without complicity. But I do think they're necessary, and I think in some ways some of what is discussed next will bring us further down this road. I think they're necessary for ensuring whatever fairness is possible to citizens who are morally opposed to abortion and who want some confidence that fetal tissue research doesn't in any way encourage or abet that practice. These kinds of restrictions don't change the basic objections to that research, nor do they, in the minds of objectors, make it good, but they mitigate the bad, which is the best that pro-life opponents of this sort of research can hope for at the moment. Thank you.
I'm going to set out some background assumptions that I think we all agree on. I'm going to give you a little bit about the law. You've already heard just a little bit about it. I'm going to say a couple of things that I think are important in thinking about why this research might be ethically permissible beyond just the scientific benefit. And I'm going to then give you some examples to think about, which hopefully might be the basis of some of our discussion. So here are some background assumptions. The first is some serious limits on what kinds of origins of fetal tissue are permissible to use in research. So I would suggest limiting it to miscarriages, where I think we all agree that there's been no prior wrongful action. Situations in which the abortion decision is made entirely separately from the decision about use in research. And I think that's really important because of the complicity questions. And third, there are, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, in vitro fertilization, many, many thousands of frozen embryos around the United States that will never be used to achieve a pregnancy. A second limit that I think is a really important one is using fetal tissue only with the consent of the parties, the sources of the tissue, if it's an embryo, the sperm and egg providers, if it's a miscarriage, potentially even also the male partner, if the male partner is available. And abortion, there might be some legal restrictions on whether you could involve the father, but that's something you might want to think about. So use only with the consent of the parties. I also think that probably we all agree that it's important to treat human remains with respect. And so I would say use only for important scientific purposes, not for trivial purposes, and use only in accord with law. So what's the law? Research on fetal tissue is permitted if the woman gives her fully informed consent. The law requires that there be a separation between the decision to have an abortion, if it's an abortion, and the decision to donate the tissue. Under federal law, no transfer for what the law calls valuable consideration is permitted. And the federal statute says that expenses such as preparation or shipment are not valuable consideration. There are federal guidelines involving funding for research involving embryonic stem cells. Those include only lines that were derived following certain kinds of important consent practices. And you ought to know that there are, of course, variations in state law about what is permitted with respect to these practices. So, what are some reasons that we might want to think about here? I think you can argue that once even if you're opposed to abortion, once that's happened independently, there's no additional harm to the fetus from research. Now, you might want to think about, as I was sitting here listening to the earlier speakers, the example that's often invoked about using the unjust fruits of medical research is the Nazis. But there was no separation there. I mean, the Nazis killed people in order to use them for research. Now, this is just something to think about. Imagine that someone is a murder victim. Clearly the murder was wrong, but the murder was a random wrong, maybe not a random wrong, but one that has absolutely nothing to do with a later decision of the relatives of the person who died to donate that person's body for medical research. So, I don't think we'd say it's wrong to use the body in medical research if the decision to make the donation is independent from the reason for the death. Now, in the case of abortion, the disanalogy there is that it's going to be the same person making the decision. But still, I think you could argue that it isn't that you had the abortion in order to produce the tissue for research. That's supposed to be the critical dividing line here. You had the abortion for other kinds of reasons. A second moral reason here that I think is really important is respect for the choices of people who want to make some meaning and get something good out of what they would otherwise regard as a tragedy. And that can be true even for abortions. I mean, when people have abortions because of fetal anomalies, they're not having an abortion because they're happy about having an abortion. They regard it as a very sad end to what was a hoped for and wanted pregnancy. So they might want to make the donation so that that kind of thing might not happen to them again and might not happen to others. And then, of course, you've heard about the benefits. Okay, so I want to give you 3 examples to think about. The first one, which is just right off the presses, and I promise I didn't collude with anybody with this, but imagine that a woman who recently traveled to the area of Brazil where there have been a quite statistically significant increases in births of babies with a condition called microcephaly. So somebody traveled to Brazil before maybe even any of this was out in the public eye, or maybe before she knew she was pregnant. She returns with symptoms consistent with the Zika virus, and after consultation with her physician and her partner, she decides to have an abortion. But she would like to donate the fetal tissue to address what is at present a seriously unknown and concerning scientific question. What is going on with the supposed effects of the Zika virus on fetal development? So that's the first example. What do you think ethically and why about the decision to donate and the use of the tissue in research? Is that a respect for the choices of the woman and the likelihood of great scientific benefit? I would argue that it is, and not complicity in a horrible wrong. Here's another example, which I actually suspect we would all agree on as a permissible case of use of fetal tissue in research. A woman who's had repeated miscarriages, and after her most recent one, would like to participate in a study involving recurrent miscarriage, that in order to participate in the study, she needs to donate the fetal tissue to try to investigate, as many people have over the years, the causes of recurrent miscarriage. There, we don't even have the antecedent wrong of an abortion. And a final case to think about, which is very important to the development of infertility care today. A couple with frozen embryos from a prior cycle of IVF. We've got a couple who has frozen embryos. They are not planning to use them to establish a subsequent pregnancy, and they don't want to donate them to another couple to use for a subsequent pregnancy. But they would like to allow the frozen embryos to be used in research, either on IVF or on to derive a stem cell line for use for research on other conditions. Now, I don't know what you think about what we ought to do with frozen embryos. The choices really are to donate them, to keep them in the indefinite limbo of a freezer, or eventually to thaw and discard them. And you could argue that it's much better to allow them to be used in research, even if you're unhappy about their ultimate demise. So those are my three examples: the Zika virus, the recurrent miscarriage, and the frozen embryos. And I think something to think about really seriously is the importance of making meaning for people out of choices, even if they're choices that they would rather not have felt they needed to make. So with that, let's start the discussion.
My name is Grant Mathers. My question is, can you extend the status of moral patient to an early embryo, and if so, how?
Chris, that might be a question for you.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think the answer is yes. I think you can. I mean, I don't think you have to even accept all of the claims that I made about early embryos to think that physicians helping parents to create an embryo in vitro can take a genuine interest in the well-being of that embryo. And just as a side point to something that Leslie just said, European nations are often much more restrictive about the process of creating embryos than the United States are. In Italy, you can only create as many embryos as you plan to implant, and that's partly out of concern for the good of the embryos. So I think you can start right then. And who are the creators of the process? Edwards and Steptoe, was that?
Anderson.
Sorry?
Anderson and
The ones who
Steptoe.
Steptoe, who first created the first in vitro embryo. I think it was Edwards in his memoirs, talks about looking at that single cell, right, which eventually became a baby, and saying, I was looking at her and thinking she's so beautiful, right? And he was invested in that. He was invested in making sure that things went well for that embryo, in recognition of the fact that it had a narrative to be written out in the future.
They are at the 8-cell stage when they're frozen, roughly, or 16-cell, something like that. So, there are no recognizable human organs at that point, if you think that's relevant. I would also note, it is true in Italy. Italy is historically a Catholic state, and in fact, there are, because of the free movement of goods and services within Europe, it's of course possible to travel elsewhere, but that is it's a controversial situation in Italy.
Right, and that's one reason why IVF units in Spain are heavily attended, because
Right.
of people coming over from Italy.
I will say one more thing about the moral status point. It's really important to distinguish the biological description from the moral attribution of moral status. And so to say that something is a human-derived cell is not the same thing as to say it has the same moral status that you or I do. You have to have a theory about what gives an entity the moral status that it has. And of course, that could be that it has a pretty good chance of developing into something like you or me.
So it seems to me that there's a consensus that there's no general ethical problem with using human tissue for medical research. The debate I'm hearing between Chris and Leslie right now is a debate about complicity in abortions. So what I'd like to hear from both of you is a little more discussion about that point and where the law is currently. Should it be changed in order to make sure that there's no complicity, or is it possible to do that in your view? Or how can we make the decision more independent, and to use Leslie's terms?
I'll go first, just to state a position in relation to some of what you said. So I think that your examples are nicely chosen, and they resonate with people, and I think that's natural to expect. But
Sure.
I think one of the reasons that they resonate is because of a presupposition that the entities that we're dealing with aren't human beings that do have full moral status. So if you think of a microcephalic baby 6 weeks postpartum, right, who's severely impaired and is going to be, is going to have a very difficult life, certainly, and think about, and maybe the parents decide to, as was done by the ancient Greeks, they expose the child, right? They leave it out for a couple of weeks, and the child dies, right? And then think about how we would think about the situation in which those parents decided then to donate the child for scientific research as a way of finding meaning, of bringing meaning out of a great tragedy. I think our sympathy with the situation would be greatly diminished because we have a different view, right, many of us, about the moral status of 6-week neonates as opposed to early stage fetuses. The position that I'm arguing is that we should think of the early stage fetus and the 6-week neonate as equal. What are they equal in? They're equal in their humanity. They're both equal human beings. And that then changes the way that we think about the morality of making these donations, the status of parents as the people who consent to making them, and the complicity of researchers dealing with them. I think if we thought consistently about that, even if we still maintained our current abortion laws for reasons that I think I would disagree with, but that are not completely unintelligible, we would have good reasons, I think, for restricting at least the use of federal money federal and state money for that research.
Well,
So where do you draw the line? Do you go back right to the one-cell zygote?
Do you disagree with the claim that the one-cell zygote is a single-celled human being?
There
Excuse
are
me.
a lot of complications to that,
There can
as
be,
you're aware.
right? Certainly not not every such single cell is, because there can be some with chromosomal defects so significant that they
Probably
can't
the
develop.
majority at that point are not slated for live birth.
Did you start off as a single-cell zygote?
Yeah, I certainly did, but
Yeah,
I didn't
and so
start
did I.
off as one with
but it
an
doesn't.
extra chromosome 16 or an extra 21.
But it doesn't follow from that that you have the right to life. Because whether or not something has the characteristics that give it the moral standing, if you want to call it that, is a separate question from the biological question of whether, if there are no interruptions, other kinds of questions, the fertilized egg will develop if it implants and develops roughly normally into a child. And I think we could all agree that the child has full moral status without thinking, we have to talk about what makes those two things equal, because there's a moral premise involved there. And I would also point out that with the Zika virus example, part of the reason I chose it is that there is a great deal of scientific uncertainty about whether fetuses infected with Zika virus are actually going to result in live births. Because one of the things that was noticed by physicians in the area around Recife was that there were a massive increase, not only in infants with significant lacks of brain tissue, including lacks of the sort that were incompatible with much in the way of length of life, but there was a massive increase in stillbirths. So they're trying to figure out what's going on.
As far as funding, is there a possibility of separating this type of research from other research to at least allow the public opportunity not to participate in fecal cell research? So as far as taxes go, if you were to separate it, is there any type of private funding that could go towards this? You would kind of satisfy both parties?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think that certainly for many of the kinds of research projects that we do, the only really appropriate source of funding is the federal government, is, for example, the NIH, because you simply wouldn't be able to generate the amount of funds necessary to do many of these projects. So there are private foundations where you can get funding for a lot of different studies, but it'd be hard to do these projects outside of an NIH system.
20 years ago in Bush 1, there was talk about the need for maybe creating fetal tissue banks for miscarriages. Is that simply not something that you think is feasible, or?
I don't know if we had fetal banks from miscarriages.
Well, I think this was one suggestion as to how sufficient amount of fetal tissue could be provided.
Fetal tissue in general.
Yeah,
not,
right.
Yeah.
But that it would be primarily coming from spontaneous miscarriages rather than induced abortion. I mean, do you think that? Can you imagine a way in which government funds are divided up and spent that would make something like that a possibility to reduce the need for fetal tissue from abortions?
I think realistically, from a biological standpoint, I think that for the most part, there is a reason why miscarriages occur, and I think that trying to use that kind of tissue to model normal fetal development that's a tough call.
So my first part of this is kind of a bit of a clarifying question. So clearly you're against abortion and everything like that. So do you agree or disagree using fetal tissue from miscarriages or like natural occurrences? And also, like you say, there's a right to life, and like I agree with that. But also, what about quality of life?
Yeah, so I think that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with doing research on tissue provided from spontaneous miscarriage. I do think, yeah, sure. I think that's just a natural right. We perform autopsies for research purposes on cadavers of all different sorts. I mean, human cadavers. That was a point of controversy at one point historically, but I think we've come to the right conclusion on that. I think that there is an important difference, and I have a lot of sympathy for Leslie's thoughts about the need for consent, because it does sound awful to have people taking tissue that nobody has said that they could and just helping themselves to it. But it's also the case that the parents of a miscarried child are in a significantly different relationship to them than the parents of a child who've had an abortion, and one that seems to me more compatible with our ordinary thoughts about consent, in which the proxy has to have the best interests of the party on whom research is going to be done in order to consent to that research. That's much more difficult to square with the abortion case. So that's in answer to your first question, I think there is an important difference, and it's one that allows us to come down squarely on the side of saying this research is fine. On the other one, I think that, so again, my position is that every single human being is equal in virtue of their humanity, right? And it's in virtue of their equal humanity that they're entitled to the most fundamental rights that human beings like you and me, right? We're entitled to these rights. And so therefore should everybody else who's like us in their humanity, everybody else is a human being. And those rights, it seems to me, are not to be abrogated in cases in which somebody else makes a judgment about your quality of life or my quality of life where you and I are concerned, right? And so we shouldn't make those judgments with regard to other people who aren't in a position to be able to consent to them. I think the cases where we do, right, and this is a very vexed issue, right, and we could have arguments about this too, right, but the cases where we even consider societally making judgments of quality of life determinative for whether somebody is going to take somebody else's life are in fact cases where that person has consented to it, right? So physician-assisted suicide, for instance, or voluntary euthanasia, right? Those are not similar to the case that we're talking about at the beginning of life.
So I want to say that the way you put that answer, though, assumes that the fetus has the right to life and that it's a case of informed consent for the interests of the fetus. The reason I was emphasizing informed consent was because I think we live in a society where people have such different views about the permissibility of abortion that it would be a wrong to the woman having an abortion and potentially her partner to have that fetal tissue be used in a way that they would find seriously immoral. Not because I think the view should be on the model of consent for research on a child or on a baby or on a fetus that's going to be brought to term. I would also point out just it is permissible sometimes to do non-therapeutic research on seriously ill children, even on your model, where the research is important to yield information about the condition that the child has, even if it won't benefit that child. And so on that model, there might be cases where it would be permissible to do research even with living children, where using your equality model, where it's not for it's not in the best interests of the child, it's not for the child's therapeutic benefit, but imagine a child who's going to die shortly from a condition that we might learn something from because of research on that child.